Listen to a doc who is an expert and father of an autistic child. He says autistic children have half or more of the MTHFR gene mutation. 33 totals, I remember. Yeah, look, a lot of the MTHFR genes can be corrected with riboflavin, which is high in animal foods. Riboflavin is very important for energy production, and that's probably the reason why it's one of those big things. So if you don't have enough riboflavin in your diet, that means if people are eating a kibble diet and they're not eating enough dairy, that's milk, and they're not eating enough meat, they will not get enough riboflavin, which means that pathway, the MTHFR 677, will be downregulated. That means they will have methylation issues while they are having, but also vitamin D and taurine play a role in the methylation cycles. So, and methionine and stuff like that. So if you've got a low vitamin D status and low methyl donors and stuff like that, it could be the reason why some of these genes don't work properly. That's sheer speculation, but there's very good association with poor vitamin D, poor, riboflavin status, poor taurine status, and a number of other nutrients primarily found in animal foods. These associations, obviously, and amongst autistic children. Nobody's actually looked at the parents at the time when they were pregnant. So, but I suspect when you take a look, I think the big one is vitamin D. To be honest, I really think vitamin D is the big one. And vitamin D does play a role with the MTHFR as well, methylation. But I think that, and I'll explain to you why. We have some observational research out there. We basically have, the sort of research that sort of tells us that when we look at certain ethnic groups around the world and their location on the globe, when they move to other localities, a population that never had autism now acquires autism, and in higher levels than the general public. It is impossible. Genetics don't change that quick. Your genes don't just flip. Mutations don't happen that fast. I suspect it's an epigenetic. Epigenetically, certain things have not been turned on or turned off. And we know when you have good levels of vitamin D, certain genes get turned off and turned on while the child is developing in the mother's tummy. So I suspect that from what I've looked at, that vitamin D is probably the key driver for this. What do I base this? I'll give you the population. It's the Somalis. If you take a look at Sweden and you take a look at, Canada, a disproportionate number of Canadians were dying from COVID. So Somali Canadians, and 70% of the death rate in the early days were basically Somalis, even though they represent less than 1% of the population, because they are dark-skinned. They don't take supplements because they never did, so they don't have a culture of supplementation, and now they're in a cold climate indoors, and tend to be very highly vitamin D deficient. Their diet hasn't changed that much. Their lifestyle very much. They still, for religious reasons, they don't, eat out as much as others in those countries. So what's the variable? Vitamin D deficiency, very high vitamin D deficiency. And autism rates amongst the Somalis, both in Sweden and in basically Canada, are higher than the actual general public. So the rest of the Canadian population has a lower rate. The rest of the Swedish population has a lower rate. But most Swedes and Canadians, light-skinned, pretty much supplement vitamin D in much larger amounts. I think that's where the problem lies. It's basically a vitamin D deficiency. I think vitamin D plays a big role in this. I believe that, if you take a look, the autism rates, when we adopted this fear of the sun and started putting creams on our skin to prevent so-called skin cancer and all that, the levels of vitamin D deficiency escalated. And so did autism rates. Prior to that, they were basically like 15,000, 1 in 15,000 or 1 in 10,000 in most industrial nations in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then as we moved from the 90s onwards, the rates started escalating. And then when we get to the 21st century, we've got levels now 1 in 20 something. And it could even be people predicting by the middle of the century, this century, it'll be 1 in 3. That's a disaster. Going from 1 in 10 or 1 in 15 to 1 in 3. Even 1 in 20 something, 29 or 26 or stuff, those sort of numbers is excessive. That's the problem. Again, because of ill thought out government policy and encouraging people to slip, slop contraindicated stuff on their skin so they wouldn't get burnt, rather than basically not removing the seed oils, which incorporate in people's skins and make them more vulnerable to burning. No, we forced, rather than actually removing the profits of the food industry, which is the seed oils, no, we decided to basically make them vulnerable to vitamin D deficiencies. And that's exactly what we did. And basically escalated some of these issues. That's my hypothesis. And when you look at a population that never had this problem and now has immigrated to these areas, and the only thing that's actually changed, and these are populations even in the early days when there is no possibility that these are second or third generation that have adopted the new ways, radically changed their diet. They haven't. A number of them still eat the way they ate in a lot of their traditional ways. They are more insular within their communities, and so tend to be less, and because of their Muslim faith, less likely to adopt foreign customs. And still, what we see is these people having these. We didn't even see it amongst people who are whites, who change, who migrate to America or whatever, change their diets, and we don't see that same rate. We only see it amongst Somalis. Why? Because they cover. Back in their own homeland, they're actually, the way homes are built is they're built around a sort of an open area. So basically, there's areas where the family can be out in the sun, be out, in the outside without having to be covered. Unfortunately, living in flats and stuff like that and having to go out, because of their religious faith, they have to cover continuously. So it's no way of getting vitamin D that way. And they don't supplement, and they're severely vitamin D deficient. And that is why they have disproportionate levels, because their environment is completely changed. And as a consequence, also because of their religious practices, the way they cover far more now in the new place that they are compared to the past. Those are other factors that are at play as well. So, yeah,